Caiaphas, who was Jesus' high priest at the time, played an important role in the choices that led to Jesus' death on the cross, which is considered the most important event in Christian history. Although he was a very important man, rumors of Jesus' resurrection kept coming back to haunt him, and one night he had a vision in which Jesus was alive again. He felt guilty after this experience and had a different view of the things that happened because of what he had done. Caiaphas was part of a powerful group of religious leaders who worked closely with the Romans, who then ruled Jerusalem. He and his friends made a lot of money and power from this alliance, as they played a very important role in managing the religious and political affairs of the Jews while they were ruled by the Romans. When Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, many people saw him as the Messiah, and Caiaphas saw a great threat to the agreement he had made with the Romans. The old order was turned upside down by Jesus' growing popularity and radical teachings, which called for a re-evaluation of traditional values and hinted at the coming of God's kingdom. Jesus' actions could have very bad consequences. Those in power in Rome could attack Jesus and the leaders of the Jewish people as a whole if they saw him as a threat to their power or a source of unrest. This could put everyone at risk, from the most important Jews to ordinary people. That's why Caiaphas called a quick meeting of the ruling council, the Sanhedrin, to discuss what was happening. There, he declared that Jesus' actions were too dangerous to be postponed. He was very clear. He thought it was better to kill one man than risk Rome's wrath spreading to the whole country. They pushed for strong action against Jesus because they wanted to maintain order and retain their power. In the end, their work led to Jesus being handed over to the Roman authorities, making the crucifixion possible. If this video has taught you anything, please like it and subscribe to receive more interesting stories like this one. With your help, we can bring these historical stories to life. Things are about to get interesting. There's a lot going on outside Jerusalem. The city was awakened by the controversial preacher Jesus of Nazareth, who had people shouting and marching fast. Some saw him as the promised Messiah, while others regarded him as a troublemaker who endangered the social order. The high priest, Caiaphas, feared that Jesus' actions would lead the Romans to intervene and take control of Judea. Not long before, Pontius Pilate had asked Caiaphas to explain why he was being so mean to the man some considered the king of the Jews. On reflection, Caiaphas remembered the first time he had met Jesus. He had observed Jesus near the Sea of Galilee, pretending to be someone else. He had been impressed by Jesus' wisdom, but he knew that his message could be dangerous. Caiaphas didn't know who Jesus really was after seeing him heal the sick and hurt people. Back in Jerusalem, Caiaphas examined Jesus in secret and found some disturbing information. Witnesses said Jesus had broken important Jewish rules by consorting with sinners and breaking Sabbath and purity laws. The most frightening things about Jesus were his grand statements about the temple and Jewish law, which gave the impression that he had unrivaled power. When Jesus expelled the merchants from the temple courtyard, Caiaphas realized that the situation was becoming tense. Ready to act, he had Jesus arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. Later, in the courtroom, Caiaphas sat on his golden throne and confronted Jesus, accusing him of many things. He pressured Jesus to apologize for what he had done, giving him a chance to obtain forgiveness from the council. Although his crown of thorns hurts, Jesus refuses to abandon his mission. After conferring with the temple elders, a heavy-hearted Caiaphas puts Jesus on the cross to protect the Jews, thinking, "May his blood fall on us and our children." A few hours after the Romans killed Jesus, Caiaphas found out. He immediately sent a message to Pilate, challenging the legality of the trial and suggesting that it should have been conducted by the Jewish Supreme Court. He believes Pilate's actions are motivated by fear or evil. "It's Jesus of Nazareth," is shouted in a busy city square under the warm spring sun. The announcement draws a crowd of people eager to see the Galilean, famous for his miraculous healings. Peter and John, two fishermen and Jesus' first disciples, were among the crowd. They had seen, with their own eyes, the strange events that could not be explained. The people in the square paid attention to Peter as he began to talk about a night spent on the Sea of Galilee. His voice echoed throughout the region. He spoke of a sudden storm that made his boat a plaything for the fierce winds, and everyone on board feared for their lives. Peter woke Jesus in the middle of the storm. Jesus, surprisingly calm, said to the winds and waves, "Silence, silence." With those words, the storm stopped, leaving the sea smooth as glass and the people in awe of its power over nature. John then told of a time when Jesus walked on water, which went against the rules of physics. As the disciples looked on in shock, Peter felt compelled to ask to join him. Jesus agreed, and Peter, who had already managed to cross the water, lost his balance and began to sink in fear. Jesus quickly rescued him and said, "You have little faith," as they crossed the water again. How was the journey? If you like our videos, please like them and subscribe to our channel. If you're really moved, you can use the super thank you function to directly support our content. Then there was another noise that made the crowd's murmurs louder. "Make way! Make way!" The crowd parted, and 4 men carrying a paralyzed friend on a stretcher begged Jesus to help them. When they laid their friend at Jesus' feet, all eyes turned to him. Jesus then said, "Your sins are forgiven you," which startled the religious leaders who accused him of blasphemy. They said that sins could only be forgiven by God. Jesus didn't give up. He challenged their doubts by focusing on the paralyzed person. He showed he was in charge by telling the man, "Get up, take your stretcher and walk." To everyone's amazement, the man complied, walking for the first time in front of the crowd. This proves the power and authority of Christ. When the paralyzed man stood up and walked confidently, the crowd shouted with joy and shock. With great joy, he cried out, "Thank God, I'm healed! I'm healed!" The crowds drew closer, for they were eager for more miracles. In the midst of all this excitement, Peter and John explained to the confused people, watching what was happening, and how it all fit together. They were beginning to understand that Jesus was not just any teacher from Galilee. But they didn't yet understand how powerful he was. Rumors were circulating that Jesus had conquered death, making people curious and skeptical. What really happened the morning after Jesus' crucifixion, and why was the high priest Caiaphas so worried? 3 days after Jesus' crucifixion, at dawn, a rumor spread that he had risen from the dead. This made Caiaphas nervous. Caiaphas trembled when Malchus, the head of the temple guards, told him that the tomb was empty and that angels, in bright light, had removed the stone. Had Jesus won the battle against death? Caiaphas called John and Peter because he was dying to know the truth. John and Peter were already telling everyone that they had found the risen Jesus near his empty tomb. His disciples didn't know who he was at first, until he showed them the wounds he had received on the cross. Before leaving, the risen Messiah broke bread with his disciples, bringing them great comfort. John and Peter, who had been frightened before, stood before Caiaphas, changed and full of faith that Christ had conquered death. They related that even Jesus' enemies had admitted that the tomb was empty and that the burial cloths were neatly folded inside. They said that over 500 people had seen Jesus rise from the dead. Since the Messiah had risen, he was considered Israel's long-awaited savior. John the Baptist had once said that someone greater than he would come into the world. Was it really Jesus of Nazareth, who had died and is now alive? As these revelations unfolded, Caiaphas felt a deep sense of unease, that drove him to lock himself in his room and ponder the enormous implications of what had just happened. After a few hours, Anna found Caiaphas lying on the floor of his study. After bringing him back to life, she listened to him talk about a frightening vision he'd had. While he was studying the messianic prophecies, a hooded figure with benevolent, sunken eyes appeared. It was Jesus. Jesus spoke softly. "Don't be afraid. You condemned me so that I might save you. This is what my Father had planned as the ultimate sacrifice for all sins." Caiaphas is so moved that he begins to weep at Jesus' feet. With Anne's help, Caiaphas calmed down and realized that Jesus had left, even though the door to the room was still closed from the inside. At that moment, he no longer had any doubts. He was sure that Jesus had really risen, that he had fulfilled the ancient prophecies, and that he had forgiven those who had killed him. In the weeks that followed, many people saw the risen Jesus, putting an end to all doubts. His disciples, who had been shocked at first, now knew that when Jesus had conquered sin and death, he claimed to be in charge of everything. Jesus defeated the world's worst enemies and offered salvation to those who had gone astray. Before ascending to heaven, Jesus gathered his disciples on a hill covered with olive trees. For the last time, the 11 saints worshipped him. Jesus commanded them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go then and make disciples in every land, baptizing them and teaching them to do everything I have told you. And I will be with you always, until the end of the world." Peter and John, once skeptics but now devoted disciples, told the others of their own experiences of Jesus' divinity. But what drove them to follow Jesus in the first place? He was a man who didn't follow the rules of his time. What signs had they seen that made them even more sure he was divine? What do Jesus' teachings show about his special relationship with God, the Father, and the Bible? When only a few people remained in the public square, Peter and John stood by and pondered what their master had said. A temple guard approached them and asked about the Nazarene preacher, because they were known to be close to Jesus. The guard asked them, "How did you come to know Jesus?" because he had heard that Jesus was very intelligent. Peter, reflecting, told them that it was his brother Andrew who had first met Jesus, and that he had felt something very special. Although Peter was skeptical at first, he was eventually persuaded to meet Jesus. Jesus' kindness and purity that day moved him deeply. Jesus' promise to teach Peter how to fish for men triggered a spiritual calling in him that changed his life forever. John also told his story and spoke of the profound things that happened to him with Jesus. This shows just how much of an impact Jesus had on those who followed him. From their first meeting, Peter couldn't help but be drawn to Jesus. His genuine love and care drew him in and captivated the crowds. He recounted how he and the other disciples had a close relationship with Jesus that went beyond public teachings and miracles. They saw him pray and quote the Bible and felt a strong bond between Jesus, God, and the holy books, as if Jesus knew every word by heart. Peter emphasized that Jesus' perfect character was proof that he was God. He was never irritable, impatient, arrogant, or rude. On the contrary, he was full of grace and truth, keeping the peace even when rushed, as if in constant contact with the invisible forces of heaven. The more we got to know him, the more his divine majesty shone through in his humility, John declared passionately. In some respects, Jesus seemed like a normal person, but at other times, the air around him seemed powerfully holy. Peter spoke of a moment that changed everything. Jesus spoke to Moses and Elijah, radiating heavenly light. The disciples didn't know how Jesus could have called these long-lost saints, but it was clear that something supernatural was happening. Then a divine voice said, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Listen to him." These events showed Jesus' followers that he was more than just a prophet, and that his words could make things happen. He knew nature and spirits well. He knew what people were thinking and feeling, and he could see what was happening far away. John said reverently, "Truly, Jesus is the Messiah, sent directly from the Father." The temple guards listening were troubled by these stories. Were these men telling lies before telling the truth? Was Jesus just a scary figure? Or could he be God in the flesh, the Messiah with the power to live and die? As the confused guard walked away, Peter and John smiled at each other. Let the skeptics doubt. Their faith is strong because they have seen the truth. Jesus, the Galilean who proved he was divine by rising from the dead after being killed, was truly the resurrection and the life. He was also King of the Jews and Lord of all. At the same time, Caiaphas, the high priest who put Jesus on the cross, had terrible visions of the risen Christ. These visions, which confirmed the wild rumors that Jesus had risen from the dead, aggravated his pain. Caiaphas had terrible nightmares every night because he had ordered Jesus' death. He slept in soft, clammy sheets. In the darkness of his room, the terrible events of Jesus' arrest and trial were repeated over and over again. When Caiaphas asked Jesus who he was during his trial, Jesus replied, "Yes, I am the Messiah, and you will see me return on the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas was furious that Jesus had said he was equal to God and should be killed for it. As news of the resurrection spread, Caiaphas's pain deepened, forcing him to face the horrific effects of what he had done. A few hours after his frightening vision, Caiaphas was confronted with a great darkness. The sky had darkened at noon, while Jesus was on the cross. The veil of the temple had been torn, and Jesus had risen, though there was a strong vigil. These signs caused Caiaphas a great deal of stress. As high priest, it was his job to differentiate between false messianic claims. But politics and jealousy clouded his judgment, and he condemned the Messiah he was supposed to recognize. If you found what you read interesting, please like, subscribe, and think of super thanks to show your support. Your dedication makes a big difference and drives us to discover more historical facts like this. As Caiaphas's nights were filled with guilt and sleeplessness, he turned to ancient texts in search of solace. But words brought him no comfort. In the midst of his study, he heard a loud voice say, "You have put me on trial, so that I may be free." Caiaphas was surprised when he looked up and saw Jesus standing in a soft light. Jesus looked at him with compassion and said, "This is what my Father had planned as the ultimate sacrifice for all sins." Caiaphas fell to his knees and wept at Jesus' feet. When he awoke after what seemed like an eternity, it was his worried wife Anna who woke him up. He told her about his encounter and whispered in wonder, "This Jesus must be the Son of God." In the weeks that followed, Jesus showed himself to many people, putting an end to doubts about his resurrection. Even James, Jesus' doubting brother, saw these events and recognized Jesus as the Lord. Belief in the resurrected Messiah spread rapidly in Jerusalem and beyond, upsetting the Jewish leaders. Caiaphas, who had changed, stopped appearing in public and preferred to pray alone. 50 days after Passover, on the eve of Pentecost, Caiaphas could no longer wait to act. With all the pilgrims in Jerusalem, he made a great choice. He shocks everyone by resigning as high priest at an emergency meeting of the Sanhedrin. He says, "I was wrong to condemn Jesus," and declares that he is not worthy to lead God's people. Caiaphas takes off his ceremonial clothes and leaves, leaving the council in a state of shock. In the ensuing chaos, his deputy Jonathan is quickly appointed leader. After retiring to his estate, Caiaphas spends his last years deeply regretting what he has done, and often thinks of the importance he had in the events leading up to Jesus' death on the cross. At the same time, the Christian faith was spreading rapidly, well beyond the walls of Jerusalem. This was due to the zeal with which the apostles preached and the powerful words of Jesus. This new faith, based on Jesus' teaching and resurrection, developed in spite of political turmoil. It had a tremendous impact on the spiritual life of the Roman Empire and the whole world. Thank you for your support.